Before we get started, I would like to introduce the SoundTransit team who are with me today. First of all, I'll go ahead and start off with Lida. Lida, if you want to kick things off for SoundTransit.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having us. Lida Shaheen, Government and Community Relations Manager at SoundTransit. I'm glad to be here. I can pass it over to Jason.
Thanks, Lida. Thanks for having us back. I'm Jason Hampton. I'm with SoundTransit. I'm the segment manager for the Duwamish and West Seattle segments of the project. Thanks. Guess I should kick it to Rhonda.
Thank you, Jason. I'm Rhonda Thompson. I work for SoundTransit in the Real Property Division. I'm the Real Property Project Manager for this project. And I will kick it off to Faith Rowland.
Hey, thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here. This is my first time attending this group. I'm Faith Rowland, and I'm the director for Real Property for SoundTransit. And I'll kick it to one of our consultant partners, Kent Melton.
Hi, thanks, Faith. I'm Kent Melton. I'm a consultant project manager in the Real Property Division, assisting Rhonda with this project.
All right, thanks, SoundTransit team. So the way the format is going to work today, oh, by the way, I'm Laura Radford, and I am a project specialist with SoundTransit and also 2018 West Sider of the Year as well. So thank you for the award back a few years ago. Appreciate that. So the way our meeting is going to run today, we are going to give you a presentation because it wouldn't be a SoundTransit without one. And we will have plenty of time for Q&A. And then Whitney and Chris from the West Seattle Junction, they sent us some advanced questions. We're going to try to get through as many as these advanced questions as possible today. If we do not get through all of them, do not fear. We will send you a follow-up meeting or follow-up document, and we will answer the questions via email from you. So let's go ahead and get started before we do any initial questions we can answer for you. All right. All right, we'll start the presentation with just like an orientation just for people who are not familiar with the project. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video, and I'm going to share my screen. Whitney, did you make me the co-host of this? I think you did, didn't you? Oh,
I just spotlighted you, but I will make you the
thank you for the spotlight. I appreciate it.
There we go.
All right. All right. Thanks, Whitney. Appreciate it. All right. Well, Lida's going to lead this part of our presentation. So Lida, it's all you.
Thanks. I'm just waiting to see the presentation whenever it's up. There it is. Okay, great. Thank you again for having us. Next slide. So as Laura mentioned, we will just start with a brief project overview, and then we'll go into a draft EIS results overview. We'll talk about property acquisition and tenant support, spend a lot of time here and in the discussion and Q&A, and then go to next steps. Next slide. Right, so project overview. So project, the West Seattle Link extensions, we are planning these two extensions together. We're currently in the planning phase from 2017 to 2023. We'll be designing the West Seattle extension from 2023 to 2027, and then in construction from 2026 to 2032, when we hope to start service. Next slide. And of course, I think as you all know, we're in that planning phase, and we recently published a draft environmental impact statement. We're in the public comment period. Based on the public comments received and the analysis, we expect the SoundTransit board later this year in June to confirm or modify preferred alternatives. We won't know the project to be built until we get through 2023, where we publish the final EIS. And after that, the board will select the project to be built, and we'll have a record of decision. The final EIS responds to substantive comments received on the EIS. So important to be commenting now. So that's part of that process as well. Next slide. So just a quick snapshot of what we're studying in this phase: preferred alternatives in pink, preferred alternatives with third-party funding in brown, and other draft EIS alternatives. These are based on board direction in May of 2019 after an alternatives development process, so an engagement process to figure out what we would study. They have been given those designations based on the information and public feedback at the time. This is what will be in front of the board to confirm or modify going forward based on the draft EIS information and the public comments. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're in the comment period. It continues through April 28th. So a few more weeks to go. And that's just a snapshot of the executive summary. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to Jason.
Thanks, Lita. This is Jason Hampton again. So before I describe the alternatives, I just want to note that there are a number of factors that are studied in an EIS. Elements of the transportation, the natural environment, and the built environment are all studied in the draft. And we study these for the project in its final built condition, but we also study this for the project during construction. I'm not going to read through every one of these here, but I just want to flag that there's a lot in there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start by describing the draft EIS alternatives, starting with the Duwamish segment. And this slide really just shows where the Duwamish segment fits into the overall West Seattle and Ballard Link Extensions project. Next slide. Thanks. So in the Duwamish segment, we're studying 3 alternatives. Each alternative would be elevated with a new high-level rail-only fixed bridge over the Duwamish waterway. Over the West Waterway, the bridge height would match the height of the existing West Seattle Bridge with 140-foot navigation clearance. Just going to quickly describe these alternatives, starting with the pink preferred alternative, which is our south crossing alternative. It would continue south along the Soto Busway, crossing the West Seattle and Spokane Street bridges around 4th Avenue South, and would continue west over Harbor Island, the East and West Waterway, and then curve around the north edge of Pigeon Point, south along Delridge Way, southwest. The South Edge crossing, which can be seen with a blue line at the bottom of the screen, is similar to the pink preferred. However, around SR 99, the alternative curves a bit further south to cross Harbor Island at the very south edge of Terminal 102, before curving back to the north and following a similar path around the north edge of Pigeon Point into Delridge. The third alternative, the north crossing alternative, shown at the top with a blue line, would also include an elevated alignment down the Soto Busway, curving to the west, this time north of the Spokane Street and West Seattle bridges, crossing over SR 99, the Duwamish, and Harbor Island, before curving south to follow Delridge Way south, crossing the ramps and the West Seattle Bridge around the Chelan Cafe and Five-Legged intersection. Next slide, please. So here we just summarize some of those things that we've seen in the draft EIS. I showed a page with all types of categories. We found some key differentiators and things that were of interest to folks when we meet with them. We have those summarized on the left. I'll go over them one by one. With the alternatives on the top with the South Crossing alternative, South Edge Crossing, and North Crossing. Before I go through these, I just want to point out the performance key at the bottom right. The darker blue indicates a higher performing category, and the lighter blue is a lower performance. So when we look at project costs, we see the highest performance, which would be the lowest cost for the South Crossing alternative at $1.2 billion, with the highest cost for the North Crossing at $1.5 billion. Both the South Crossing and South Edge Crossing alignment option would have the same number of residential displacements at 26. The North Crossing would not have any. When we look at business displacements, we see the South Crossing and North Crossing similar, with the South Edge Crossing slightly lower. But when we break that down into maritime dependent businesses, we see the lowest number with 3 for the south crossing and the highest number for the north crossing with 10. And then when we look at park effects, this is a park space that would be permanently removed from park space and converted to a transportation use. We see about 1.5 to 1.9 acres with the south crossing and south edge crossing, and none with the north crossing alternative. We have a couple of other considerations under each alternative that I'll describe. Starting with the south crossing, we note pigeon point constructability. Pigeon Point is a steep slope. There's wildlife corridors. There's critical areas, including wetlands, and it's also in close proximity to the existing West Seattle Bridge. So we just note some of the constructability and engineering challenges there. We also note the BNSF Bascule Bridge on the West Duwamish Waterway. It's a historic rail bridge with the south crossing alternative and the segmental box girder bridge. We would have a column and foundation in the cove between the BNSF bridge and the West Seattle Bridge. So it's just a constrained corridor leading to some engineering and constructability challenges. With the south edge crossing alignment option, we note the pigeon point constructability again. We also note in-water columns are necessary. In the draft EIS, we evaluate a segmental box girder bridge, which is a concrete bridge similar to the West Seattle Bridge, but we're also looking at alternate bridge types, some of which would be able to avoid in-water columns for the south and north crossing, but none of those bridge types would be able to avoid in-water columns for the south edge crossing. And finally, the marinas on Harbor Island would be affected by the south edge crossing alignment option. There's 2 marinas on Harbor Island. Moving to the north crossing, we note the bridge proximity to the Port of Seattle container terminals at T5 and T18. We also note there's a Terminal 25 restoration site that was just recently funded for design on T25 South that could be affected by this alternative. And further east in Soto, Fire Station 14, which is also a training facility, could be affected by the north crossing alternative. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the Delridge and West Seattle Junction segments together. They're very interconnected because of the connections between Delridge and the West Seattle Junction segment, depending on whether we connect to a tunnel or elevated in the junction. So I'll go through these quickly. Next slide, please. Thanks. So here we show those 2 segments, starting on the right with the Delridge segment. All of the alternatives in Delridge would include 1 station. The guideway and station would be elevated, and the stations would essentially be in 3 different locations. Starting at the top, we would have it shown with a blue box there at the southeast corner of Newcourt. We'd have the Andover Street station alternatives, 2 different heights there. This station would be west of Delridge Way Southwest, north of Southwest Andover Street. We also have a Delridge Way station. This station would be on Delridge Way, north of Dakota Street and south of Southwest Andover Street. So it'd be over the roadway with station entrances on both sides of Delridge Way. The third station location shown with pink is the Dakota Street station location. This would be south of Dakota between Delridge Way and 26th Avenue Southwest. Again, 2 different station heights there. We have a couple of corridors that we'd travel through in Delridge. One along Genesee. We would have potential alignments along Genesee, either on the south side of Genesee, along the north edge of the West Seattle Golf Course, or on the north side of Genesee to minimize the effects on the golf course. The lower height stations in Delridge would enter a tunnel portal along Genesee around 31st Avenue Southwest. The taller stations would continue into an elevated Avalon station. The corridor is shown with the blue lines with the Andover Street station. One would continue west along Andover, curving to the southwest to follow the Avalon Way right-of-way into an elevated station at Avalon. The other would continue further west along Andover and Yancey before curving to the southwest to closely follow the West Seattle Bridge approach to Fauntleroy Way. That would be a retained cut station, which is just below ground, similar to the International District Station. In the West Seattle Junction segment, we have a range of alternatives with 2 stations, one at Avalon and one at Alaska Junction. The Avalon stations would be either elevated or tunneled. The Alaska Junction stations would either be elevated or tunneled as well. The Avalon stations are all in the vicinity of 35th Avenue Southwest, Southwest Genesee, and Avalon Way. The Junction stations at Alaska Junction would either be in the vicinity of Southwest Alaska between 41st and 42nd, or we have one station that would be a bit further east, straddling Southwest Alaska at Fauntleroy Way. So it's kind of the quick rundown of those. We can answer questions about specifics later, but I want to turn it back over to Laura. Oh, no, sorry, the summary. Okay, I'm going to go through this quicker than the last one.
Yeah, Jason, I think we can
Yeah.
just flash it and move on is my thought.
Yeah,
Got results,
certainly.
we've compared them, and then keep going.
Sounds good. Yeah, so
Yeah.
all of the alternatives that we just described are on here, except the 2 Delridge Way Station alternatives. And next slide, please. Oh, well,
That was it.
that's it. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Anything else on that, Jason, before I hand it over to real property?
No, I think we'll shift to real property so we can save time for Q&A. Thanks.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks for the overview.
SoundTransit team, if I can just jump in, we definitely we thought we were going to spend most of our time on Q&A, so I hope you guys are reserving a lot of time for Q&A. There's not going to be much more presenting.
We do have a lot of time for Q&A.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yes.
Thanks, Laura.
We you spoke, we listened. All right, so we're just going to pop over to real property. It is important that the people like on the call, they do receive some basic information before we go to Q&A, just so it gives you some time to really absorb the information and you can ask thoughtful questions. So I'm going to send this over to real property. Kent or Rhonda, who would like to present this piece?
I can. So we're going to get into what a potentially affected property owner is. I think this is a person who we impact all or a portion of their property. A letter was sent out to these property owners, but that does not mean that a decision has been made. It's just a potential. Next slide. So this goes through the timeline again that we've already talked about. It will be the final decision in 2023, that sometime around the end of 2023 or that SoundTransit will identify the actual property rights that are needed to construct the system. And that is also, as soon after that is when the SoundTransit board authorizes property acquisitions. So SoundTransit, the beginnings of our property acquisition is the preparation of an appraisal where we determine fair market value that's for all the properties that are needed for the project. And it's at that time that SoundTransit also provides relocation assistance to people and businesses that are displaced by the project. That process includes referring them to other properties and helping them with their moving costs and assistance along the way from beginning to the end. So I think that is, why don't you go to the next slide?
Why don't we actually, do we want to just go straight to Q&A? I think
So because
these slides for backup.
Yeah, these slides are more for property owners. Yeah,
Let's do that.
okay.
So Laura, there's some questions I think we got in advance. Do you want to start firing those off?
I sure will. Hold on just a second here. All right, so our first question
You can
was,
slide deck down too, maybe.
yeah, I'm going to.
Yeah, okay.
There you go.
You can stop sharing your screen is
There
probably
you go.
to do it.
All righty. All right, so let me just pull this up here and turn my video back on. Okay, and thank you so much to for Whitney and Chris for sending these advanced questions to us. it gives us a moment to just create some good, thoughtful answers. And so we're going to read these, go through these, and then we're also going to see what other questions you have. All right, so the first one, and this is, I'll send this to Kent. Will he be reaching out to business owners to let them know they are being affected by the properties purchased?
Yes, so that's kind of what we're doing now, and it'll go through the entire process. We'll be our community engagement folks will be reaching out, and we'll once there's a preferred alignment picked, real property will have to do what's called a RAMP, which is a real estate acquisition management plan and a relocation plan. And so it's kind of a report that we have to do for our project. And at that point, we may be reaching out to each individual business along the preferred alignment at that time to learn more about your business and what you do and how you service the public. So yes, we will be doing that.
I want to create a little space here. Jordan, can you jump in real quick? I know you had a question directly into this. See a little deep dive here.
I have some pretty hard questions, so I'm not sure if we want to do that right now or if we want to do that later once they get through the stuff they've prepared. I guess the shorter version of one of my questions would be, so I'm Jordan Crawley. I'm the policy director and general manager of Alki Beach Academy, and I was asked by the owners to represent them here tonight. We're located at 2414 Southwest Andover Street, which we share property with Nucor Steel. We are one of 5 properties in the Delaware area that are identified as a necessary acquisition for every alternative. And we've had 0 outreach from SoundTransit. So as far as I'm reading the EIS, as long as I'm reading it correctly, it doesn't matter what decision is made, we're affected. So we shouldn't have to wait for a decision for outreach. So what's SoundTransit's plan to work with businesses in our situation?
Can I start here maybe, and then I'd love to defer also to my colleagues here in Faith. I see you here as well. At this point in the project, yes, I think, Jordan, what you're saying in terms of seeing the draft EIS, and there may be situations where a property and a business might be affected by all the alternatives that are on the table. And we would hope to definitely be talking to folks as much as we can. At this point in time, I know we don't have a project to be built. And as you may, the folks were sort of following the process going from the alternatives development phase and into the draft EIS. We actually had alternatives or refinements that came in and really changed kind of what was on the table for folks. And so one thing we're just very sensitive to, especially in reaching out, is just that things may continue to change in the environmental process, but our intention is to be reaching out to folks. And so I'm glad we're here and having this conversation, and I'm sorry to hear you haven't heard from us, but Faith and others may want to chime in a little bit more, please.
Sure, Jordan. As Lita said, absolutely, this is the time for us to learn who may be impacted by a decision the board's going to make, and start working with you individually and providing individual information that might be unique to your business or your situation. So starting today, we're absolutely available to you to work individually. I think what we've tried to do up to this point is provide as much general information as we can. I know we've posted the relocation brochures that give general information on the project websites. And if you haven't gotten a link to that yet, I'll make sure you do as part of this. And then we can set up follow-up meetings. We've been reached by a few individual businesses where they wanted to talk, not in this large public format, but in a more individual format, where you can say, okay, here are my issues at my location. What can you tell me specifically? And so let's set up a follow-up do that with you for sure. And then, and there are no hard questions. There are ones I might not have all the answers for, but it's okay. Bring them. If you want to lay all your questions on us, that's okay too. We're here for that.
I mean, I will if there's no reservations about it in the rest of the
Hey,
group.
let's get into the pre-submitted questions as well. I just wanted to tag that in because it was a follow-up on that, and then afterwards we can fire away. So
Perfect.
All right, that sounds great. Okay, so the next question is, are the landlords required to tell their tenants if the property is being acquired? And Faith, you're up on the main screen, so I'm just going to continue to send these to you.
Sure. The property owner is not required to do something by the Uniform Act. And so we follow federal guidelines in the Uniform Act. So we look at what SoundTransit's required to do. And the first piece is we're notifying people that may be affected and hoping to reach all the tenants that would be affected as part of this process. The landlord is a separate negotiation from a tenant. Now, there are places and businesses where the landowner is also the business owner. There'll be two parts of the equation there: the acquisition of real estate and the benefits available as part of the relocation. So there are two components depending on if you're the owner-occupant, owner business, as it were, or a tenant within that business. A tenant is eligible for relocation the moment we make an offer. And so we always make sure that tenants are aware at that point and receive general information if they haven't up to this point. Does that help?
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely appreciate it. And if you want to drop your questions also in the chat as well, we'll take a look at those and add these to these like this general list of questions that we have. All right, so the next question is, how much time will affected businesses have from the time of notice to when they will need to be out of their buildings? I think Faith, you're just on, like, you're just front and center.
I see
you're
that.
front and
Unfortunately,
center.
since my camera's up, I'll take these. There is a statutory timeline within the Uniform Act, which is the place that codifies all the benefits under a federally funded project. And you will receive no less than 90 days. Now, every business owner will immediately tell me it will take way more than 90 days to move me. And we agree with you. In most cases, there is a much longer period of time in which we're working with you, really from the time the alignment is determined and the board has us move forward. But there will be no less than a 90-day notice. Typically, it is much longer than that.
All right, thank you for that. All right, the next question is let's see here. This is a good one. If you have a long lease, will it be honored? Example, I'm in a 10-year lease. If not, how will the business be compensated?
Sure. Most leases, if you read through them, include language that addresses eminent domain as a part of a public capital project and an acquisition. And so we'll want to work with you closely to see what your lease says. And if there is a longer term, then typically the value of that lease is addressed in the appraisal process. So again, each is unique to what the language in the four corners of the lease are. And we work with each tenant to see what their lease is. There are a number of other reasons. How much are you paying? What's the duration? You know, what is your equipment versus what is a landowner's equipment? Those are the other kinds of things we look at in a lease.
All right, thank you. And I think this goes back to your answer from the above question. What are the legal ramifications if you break a business lease? I think those are combined.
Right. The condemnation language, eminent domain language in a lease typically allows for it to be terminated due to those activities.
Okay, All right, so the next question, there is no more commercial real estate in West Seattle like the building that I'm in. Most of our customers will not drive to a location outside of West Seattle. What options are there to support a business like mine? And if forced to close, will you compensate for our loss?
A lot of questions rolled into that.
That is a
one
lot.
question. There is one answer that we often have to use, and it's called it depends. Every unique scenario that you laid out there really comes to how we help support the relocation of a displaced business. We look at what you have, but also what you need, what your plans are going forward. I'm working with one right now who has said, I want to downsize. I have too much space. Things have changed, or I want to be in a different location. If you want exactly what you have now, then we'll take a look and see what we can do to find a property that can meet your needs. There are reestablishment benefits that are limited, but they're still to help modify a new facility that might not quite meet your needs, but could be modified. There are, looking at some other parts, I don't want to miss any parts of your question. Options to support a business. We give advisory services from day one and help businesses find the resources they might need. We work with you on an individual basis because everybody's unique. We don't force people to close. A business can choose to continue on or to do something different. There are tools within relocation that can allow for some benefits to do that. There are benefits to store property for a period of time. Let's say you're doing modification to a new building and you can't get in there right away. We can pay to store things. So again, every business displacement is going to be absolutely unique to you and what's in front of us with you. And we want to work with each of you individually.
Faith, can I ask a quick question here? I think
Sure.
There's a lot of quasi answers in there that are specific and address, I think, a lot of people's concerns, which I know it's tough for you to do here on a meeting. What is the benefits package like? Are you talking like up to $20,000 of relocation and that's all they get for relocating from here to another city and losing their customer base? Or is there like a more significant economic impact to the business being forced to move that's compensated for?
There is no loss of business reimbursement under the relocation program. But what there is really three categories. Advisory services, that's unlimited. Actual reasonable and necessary move expenses, that's unlimited. So if it costs $100,000 to move you to a new location of actual move expenses, that's unlimited and paid for. Reestablishment is limited to $50,000. The federal guidelines limit it to 25. In Washington, we've actually increased it to the Washington statutory amount, which is $50,000. There are smaller things like $2,500 for site selection, for looking for sites. There's some other benefits that are part of that. We can modify personal property to fit in a new location. Those are things that can happen.
So there's zero compensation for economic injury to the business that's forced to move besides putting them in a new place. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the business impact itself, what we try to do is minimize it by working closely with somebody to help get them reestablished in that new location. What we don't do is viability of a business, whether they're successful or unsuccessful before our project, is something that is hard to measure, right? And so we do try to do everything we can to help a business move in the way they want, where they want. There's a 50-mile radius. If somebody says, I don't want to be where I'm at now, but I want to be over there, we can work with them to help. We don't tell you where to move. You tell us where you want.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I hope we're getting to all of your questions. We did have this one question come in. I think we'll need to talk a little bit more to a broader SoundTransit team, but I will pose it here because I don't want you to think that we didn't see the question. And the question is, what kind of support or resources will there be for businesses whose normal operations will be disrupted during construction, but not necessarily fully displaced? And I think, Faith, do you want to handle this one? I think we need to take that one to a broader team.
I think it's a broader team. I'll start. And one of the things is as you see with the team that's here today, it takes a village to do one of these projects. And there will be community outreach folks working with every business as part of the construction. I guess I'll, Laura or Lita, I'll let you guys take that piece of it. Because while we're working with the business owner on their, those that are displaced, really our community outreach troop works with folks during construction.
Lita, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, and I guess I feel like the nature of the question was about, compensation related to impacts that are not specifically acquiring property, if I understood that accurately. And I think, that's a really important part of sort of commenting on the draft environmental impact statement and the comments the impacts that we describe in there in our draft statement. There may be impacts that we don't realize because we are planners or engineers and there's only a certain amount of data we can gather. And so as you look at the EIS and the layout for the alignments and the plans and the potential construction that we see, being able to articulate the concerns and the impacts to your business that you're worried about and having mitigated through the environmental process would be, I think, an important component because that is potentially handled more in that way.
All right. Follow-up questions for us. We're getting through the questions. So we do have a couple questions for Jason regarding the preferred alignment, but I do see Pete Spalding with his hand up. So Pete, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Well, I would just like to follow up on what Lita was just saying, because to me, the questions seem, if you stop and think about it, we're still, the West Seattle is still under the detriment of the West Seattle Bridge being closed. At the same time that the bridge was closed, the city did just the ginormous Rapid Ride H project along Dell Ridge Way Southwest. Now, once those things are done, now some of these same people are going to be impacted by SoundTransit construction. So is there going to be any mitigation to the neighborhood to compensate in any way whatsoever for one more ginormous construction project that's going to impact our neighborhoods?
Yeah, no, Pete, I think that you make a fair point. That's a good aspect of comments. I think the hope is that we're engaging folks early and working with you, not just through the draft environmental impact statement. Of course, we're going to get comments and questions. There's a certain level of design that the project is at right now. We have multiple alternatives on the table. As we're able to refine and narrow and start to get a better understanding, we can do deeper design, and we're going to have to keep engaging with folks. We're going to need to engage around, what does the construction management plan look like? How are we routing cars, and what does construction really look like? When we actually get design more refined and we get a contractor on board, how can we work with communities to minimize the impacts of that construction? But I don't want to minimize what Pete said in terms of what West Seattle's been facing with all of the construction and the challenges of transportation right now. So just to hear you on that, and good to comment on. I hope that was responsive.
Jordan, looks like you have your hand up again. What can we answer for you?
So I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, so please forgive me for that. But right now, our program is the second largest privately owned childcare program in West Seattle. And we're in the midst of an expansion that would make us the single largest privately owned childcare program in the city, serving almost 300 kids. We're also the least expensive of the largest centers in our community by about $7,500 a year on average. And we're at least 10% below the median tuition for Seattle. Our programs in the Fry Commerce Center, which I mentioned before, is one of only 5 properties in the Delridge area deemed as a necessary acquisition for every alternative. Fry Commerce Center is owned by the Fry Art Museum, which owns the buildings in the Commerce Center and uses that revenue to generated by the complex to keep the art museum free and accessible. But interestingly enough, after speaking with Fry over the last couple of days, they haven't been engaged by SoundTransit either. Right now, the childcare industry is struggling to recover from the pandemic. Countywide, pre-COVID capacity only met about 46% of the need. And at least at my last count, 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 childcare programs that were open at the beginning of 2020 are at least temporarily closed right now. We've been saying for years that we're in the midst of a childcare crisis, but despite that, we are planned to be displaced, regardless of the decision made by SoundTransit. Not only that, but the EIS doesn't even acknowledge the fact that we exist. There isn't one time in the EIS where it's mentioned that they plan to remove us from our home in 98106. 98106 is the only West Seattle zip code that isn't 70 to 80% white and doesn't have a median income over $80,000 a year. And if we're forced out, 1 in 10 licensed childcare spots in that zip code will leave with us just by our current capacity. Post expansion, our program would make up nearly 21% of the total licensed capacity in our zip code. And based on our absence from the EIS, SoundTransit plans to quietly yank us from our community. So my first tough question is about section 4.24 and appendix L4.4, where SoundTransit identifies social resources, which includes childcare programs, what you guys call community facilities. In the EIS, SoundTransit fails to identify our program, which tells me that they had no idea we exist. First, how did that oversight occur? And second, how will SoundTransit address that oversight and work with our program immediately and moving forward?
Jordan, this is exactly why we do a draft environmental impact statement before we do a final. It's because there's a certain amount that we can know planning a project this extensive through urban communities that we can find easily and readily, and some things that we may miss. And that's something that would be really helpful to put exactly that in the draft environmental impact statement comments that you submit, and I hope that you will. And we would love to work with you immediately. I think there is a differentiation between the alternatives in that location, and it might be helpful to sit down with Jason and our team and look at the differences between those alternatives, and also have our team understand a little bit more too about the concerns and what it would look like working with you to make sure that West Seattle continues to have and benefit from the services that you provide. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm sorry that that you feel that the draft EIS has been deficient in that. And I'm also glad and thankful to the chamber and other folks for convening this space so that we can talk. This is exactly what we hope the process will lift up for us, so that we can clarify and make amends.
So that actually kind of brings me to my next question.
Okay.
I've looked at what the alternatives mean for our complex. And as far as I can tell, DEL 5 and DEL 6 are the only alternatives that actually directly, visibly, as far as I can tell, impact our complex. They drop a station right on our head.
Right.
The other alternatives, I'm not sure why we're a necessary acquisition. So I'm hoping someone can explain that.
Yeah, so and then I want to make sure, if there's other questions too, that we go through, and we are maybe more conservative with the draft EIS on potential impacts than what we know we're not necessarily going to need one, because we're obviously reaching out to folks for every single alternative. We also don't differentiate at this point between a partial acquisition or kind of exactly what it might look like, because we are at such a low level of design. If I'm saying stuff wrong, please jump in, colleagues. But we can sort of, when we talk with you individually, we can show you how the alternatives are looking right now and help you in making your comments and understanding the sort of how the alternatives might be different. And that might inform how you sort of provide comments to us. But just because you get a potentially affected property owner letter, or your property owner does, and you hear about it, does not mean that we are necessarily going to acquire your whole property, or necessarily going to need to acquire all of it, all of it. So, and maybe Faith or others can jump in on that too, but I think that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, I think the same notification goes out to a potentially affected property owner, whether we're buying a temporary construction easement to improve a sidewalk or a driveway, or acquire the whole parcel. There's no distinction when those notices go out because of all of the alternatives. So yeah, I think, Jordan, this is a perfect opportunity for us to sit down with the engineering side of the information and with Jason and the design side and really look at what each alternative may or may not impact, so that then your comments could be, you know, I like this one because, I don't like this one because. That gives you more detail that you can then inform your comments. Yeah.
Jordan, I will reach out to you individually to set up a briefing with you.
Okay, and you guys kind of addressed one of my questions already, so I'll skip to my last one. It was mentioned earlier, and I think Faith answered the question roughly, about trying to relocate businesses that may not be able to find comparable space in our community. So our program, as far as the leases we've acquired over the last few years, will be occupying 20,000 square feet. That space does not exist anywhere near where we are. And even if it did exist, it wouldn't be currently zoned as educational space. So there'd be a change of use process, permitting, re-engineering, architecture, build out, all of that stuff. Which I know, Faith, you mentioned that the 90-day period is just the minimum, but I mean, right now we're in the process of planning an expansion and we're looking 18 months out minimum. And judging from everything that I've seen so far, we're supposed to be, if we are displaced, we're supposed to be gone by 2026, I think. So how far out are we looking when, like, if a program of our size has to move, when can we expect to actually be engaged in that relocation process and find an adequate space that's comparable to what we have and the options that we have to expand, because we still have options on top of that 20,000 square feet where we're not going to lose our entire customer base, like was mentioned earlier, because we are a local service. We provide for people in the community. So the 300 kids that go to our program at the time we're displaced will have to find new childcare in West Seattle, which is right now not really an option. Everyone has 100, 200, 300, 400 child long wait list. So how do we address that?
So the first way to do it is by exactly what you're doing, is giving us the kind of detail that I didn't have. So I'll just speak personally about what you provide and the services. As soon as the SoundTransit board selects preferred alignment and tells us to go forward, finalizing the EIS process, at that point, we'll know which alignment we're going to be talking about and which property owners and which businesses. And as I think Rhonda mentioned earlier, one of our first steps is to come out and talk to you. Now, the length of time that the acquisition process takes is about 2.5 years from that point where we get direction to go forward and for the board to authorize the alignment. So it is a long process. And really it starts when the board tells us, here's your alignment. Did that help? I think Jordan froze on me, so I don't know if I froze.
It kind of helps, but I'm still stuck on the fact that right now our property is listed as a necessary acquisition for every alternative. So I'm not sure why we're having to wait for a decision.
The one thing that we do have to wait for is the EIS process to be finalized. That record of decision is part of our requirements before we can acquire any properties. And before we can't make offers to acquire a property until after the EIS process. We can do some things ahead of time. I said, like Laura said, we can meet with you tomorrow. I can meet with you, maybe not tomorrow, but next week. And let's get started getting some more of these details. Yeah, I think there's There's nothing that says I can't keep sharing information and getting information and trying to look at alternatives so that you can inform the EIS and so that we can be ready to go when the EIS is finalized and when the board tells us to move forward with the project.
All right.
Laura, this is Jason.
Yeah.
So Jordan, I just wanted to kind of pin one thing that Lita said, Appendix L4 that you mentioned that showed the Fry Commerce Center would be potentially affected by each alternative. That does not differentiate between a full or a partial acquisition. So I think it would be really good to meet because some alternatives would, there's 4 buildings there, as you know, would affect all 4 buildings, as you noted, with the stations Del 5 and Del 6. Others would not. And so what that effect looks like on your business, being in one of the buildings that's kind of on the northeast side, would be different than the buildings that are right on Delridge Way. So I would just encourage you to, take up Laura's offer to meet. We can get Faith and others in the room and we can really look at the Appendix J drawings to kind of see what the construction staging and the construction activity would look like around there. So hopefully that helps, but we look forward to meeting and talking more.
With our expansion, we'd occupy 2 of the 4 buildings in the complex. One entirely and the other almost entirely. And only, well, I guess one of the buildings is technically right on Delridge, but the other 2 buildings that are close to us that are also listed as required acquisitions for every alternative are actually Skylark and Mode Music, they share a building, and Ounces. But they're not, they have Delridge addresses. They're not part of the 2414 Southwest Andover Street. So
right,
they are technically a barrier between us and Delridge, but we're still listed as a necessary acquisition for all the other alternatives that are not 5 and 6. And so if we're missing half.
Yeah, I think it would be good for us to talk.
Yeah. I think so.
I know there's
Yeah,
others
yeah.
here too, so I just want to make sure. I see Lindsay's got her hand up.
Yeah, we've only got a couple minutes left.
Thanks. Well, Jordan, I appreciate you joining us here today and you highlighting, as a West Seattle mom with a young little, we need you here in our community and you need to stay here in their community. So I think I appreciate the highlight on Alki Beach Academy because you guys have done wonderful things for this community for many, many years. And no doubt we will support and making sure you continue to do that. I'm sort of asking more of a general question because I think, yes, it took this meeting to help identify Alki Beach Academy, but what are other things the West Seattle Chamber can do, or what are other tactics that the SoundTransit plans on doing to try to identify more businesses? Like, I'm sure Alki Beach Academy is not the only one on the line that's having these issues, as sort of has been indicated in this conversation. And so I guess maybe it's not even a question that has to be answered today, but do we kind of put periodic messages out? Is there kind of brief education tools we can be doing? Is there people at SoundTransit that are going to start maybe scouring some of these lines to sort of see what other, in the outreach? I know Lita and your crew is busy with many things and you can't, do everything, but just wondering if there's other things we can be doing as, the biggest business association within the West Seattle Peninsula that we can support this and kind of keep this dialogue front and center to make sure all the Alki Beach Academies out there are getting identified and addressed and getting the attention that you have kindly been willing to give Jordan and his team moving forward, because I think they're not the only ones out there. I have no doubt, but I also understand you guys have a lot on your plates and there's only so much you can do.
Thank you, Lindsay. I want to say that sounds like really like a partnership that I would love to build upon with the team. I think if we could do that more all along the line with the SOTO BIA here with West Seattle Chamber and you all, and that would be really, really good. So I think that's a good next step. And thank you again, Jordan, and everyone else.
I see also Candy had something in the chat, which I think is a good question on timeline, as businesses can't totally, you got to have some certainty in running business. So I think Candy's got a great question in there for you guys to address as well.
Yeah. One thing that can be really helpful is that we do have a lot of alternatives in West Seattle. You may have seen on that map. The more we can get further along in this environmental process, we get a better sense. Sometimes you've got, in some locations, we have less alternatives, right? You start to have more of a narrow focus. which can be helpful for talking to folks. I think one, outreach is super important, of course, and I think Lindsay just highlighted one way where we can broaden that engagement and work together to reach folks that maybe we don't have contacts with. But then beyond that, I think being able to start to narrow the range of alternatives will also help give the community a little bit more of a sense of the direction the project is headed, so we can really focus in on more serious conversations. Right now, with so many alternatives, you know, in some locations it looks like there's many over one property, but in a lot of locations we've got a pretty wide range, so that can also help us. Candy, I saw that you turn your camera on and would love to give you a chance to speak.
As business owners, you're trying to plan. Like, part of my plan was this was going to be my retirement, right?
Yeah.
And there's other businesses on here that are trying to address that too. But now we're at your mercy, waiting for you to finish your EIS to determine if we'll even have a place to be. And there's no place for me to move. So I think you guys are going to miss me. You may not. I could still be at risk, but I've been asking questions since the beginning of time, and you guys are still giving the same answers, which I'm sorry, they come across as non-answer answers. They just do. As a business person, it feels like that. But how are we supposed to plan for 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, when we're sitting on the edge of our seats waiting to find out if you're ultimately going to take our livelihood away from us and potentially not have anywhere to go? Just my 2 bits worth, sorry.
No, thank you. That's a hard process.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining together today. These are difficult conversations to have, and we'll, continue to, have these discussions with everyone as we all move forward. We're here and available for individual property owner meetings. You can reach out to us, and if you would like us to come back for a follow-up meeting with you, we are always happy to do that as well. We can gather the SoundTransit team together and continue to have these discussions and answer all of your questions. With that, I will hand this back to the wonderful West Seattle Chamber.
Thank you, SoundTransit, for being here and being available for our commercial tenants. Do we have any member announcements at this time before we close? And I will also